Mr. Finkelstein, I'd like to ask you a question about something that you have said in a past lecture. You say in May 8, 2005 lecture at the University of Illinois that Alan Dershowitz's book, The Case for Israel, is sheer, unadulterated, from the first uppercase letter to the last period, a complete fraud. However, the New York Times said about the same book that Dershowitz knows how to construct an argument, especially effective at pointing out the hypocrisy of many of Israel's critics. This book is also praised by the Washington Post, London Times, Jerusalem Post, and Haaretz. Can you please explain how you and the Times came to such different conclusions about the same book?
Well, that's a perfectly reasonable question. And here I would say that each person has to use his or her own judgment, his or her own reasoning faculty. I reached my conclusion after reading the book carefully several times. I probably read it more times than Professor Dershowitz read it. And I examined the sources, checked his citations, and I reached the conclusion the book was a complete fraud. And I said as much when I publicly debated him on Democracy Now! I agree with you, or what would be implicit in your question, had I limited myself to simply declaring the book a fraud or a fake from the first uppercase letter to the last period, had I limited myself to that, you would have probably excellent grounds for questioning my judgment. But I recognized that a responsible person cannot limit him or herself to simply an ad hominem attack or an epithet. You have a responsibility to document it. On Democracy Now! I debated him for approximately 2 hours, and I tried to cite some of the documentation. You can watch the program and decide for yourself how effective he was in rebutting my claims. But then I went one step further, which is I sat down and I wrote a book approximately 320 pages in length, in which I literally went through each and every one of his claims. Literally. I know it sounds boring and it sounds tedious. And what I did was I juxtaposed his claims not against what Professor Finkelstein says, not against what the Palestinian Authority says, not against what the Arab League says. I simply took each and every one of his claims and juxtaposed it against what mainstream human rights organizations have to say. Most importantly, the Israeli human rights organizations. So I quote what B'Tselem, the Israeli Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, has to say, what Pikati, the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel, has to say, what Physicians for Human Rights in Israel has to say. I juxtapose the two, and I show that in each and every one of his claims, from the first to the last, he's completely falsified what the documentary record shows. Again, you have to use your judgment, and that means if this issue is important enough to you, and we all have 1,000 things in our life, but if it's important enough to you, you sit down, read the book, juxtapose what I say or the citations I use against Dershowitz's, and decide for yourself. But bear in mind, there's one very big difference between Professor Dershowitz and myself. Well, many, but one that's germane here this evening. The big difference was I have complete faith in the reasoning faculty of ordinary human beings. We're not talking about particle physics here. We're not talking about rocket science. Most ordinary people having the abilities of Cartesian logic, elementary reasoning, and evidence can judge for themselves. So I proceeded to write a book. The big difference between Professor Dershowitz and myself is I did not try to suppress his publication. I'm not afraid of the truth. I'm happy to throw my book out there and let people decide for themselves. It was Professor Dershowitz who mounted a campaign threatening, in his words, he said, if University of California Press publishes his book, I'm quoting him now, I will own that publishing house. He then went as far as the Terminator. He went to Arnold Schwarzenegger, the governor of California, to try to block publication of the book. And to the credit of Governor Schwarzenegger, he formally replied that this was a freedom of speech issue and academic freedom, and he wasn't going to intervene. Whether Schwarzenegger knew what he was talking about, I don't know, but it was still a victory. I'm not afraid to test my claim against what the record shows. And I might add, my publishing house was very cautious. My book went through 9 outside readers and 5 libel lawyers, because they were very fearful of Professor Dershowitz's libel threats. Not because they thought they would lose the case. That wasn't the problem. The problem is, with most libel cases, they're never settled in court. They're settled out of court, and they're very expensive. And so my publisher said, if Professor Dershowitz sues us in New York, they're in California, they said, we don't even have enough money to fly our staff out to New York. You know, it's a university publishing house. I now have to I have to throw the ball in your court and say, you read the book, you look at the evidence, and to do what I think is the right thing to do. The right thing to do is not to believe me. I don't believe in that. You shouldn't believe me. I always liked the credo that Karl Marx, he was once asked, what's the credo you live by? And he said, de omnibus dubitandum, to doubt everything. And I grew up in a generation where a lot of people like to wear this black button with the words, 2 words, question authority. And I think that's a wise way to conduct one's life. So you shouldn't believe the New York Times, you shouldn't believe Dershowitz, and I'm telling you, coming straight from me, don't believe me. Use your own brain. Go, read the sources, and decide for yourself.